Good evening and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. My name is Dan Derry and I'm the president of the Institute of Fulfilled Eschatology. Hey, I want to share some thoughts regarding the parable of the talents in Matthew 25 with you this evening. This will be an introductory video where we just laid a little bit of a foundation that we can build upon in the upcoming videos. And what I simply want to do is I just want to look at Matthew 25 verse 14. We want to do a couple short word studies in that verse. And through that, I hope to establish a first century time limitation that we can place upon the fulfillment of this parable. So Matthew 25 verse 14 says this, "For it," that is the kingdom, "is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them." So catch this. This parable, number one, is about the kingdom. But number two, it is about his own slaves. That means that this judgment and separation that we see later in the parable, that we'll get to, concerns his own slaves. It is the judgment and separation of the disciples of Christ, watch this, based upon their fruitfulness concerning what he gave them to possess. Okay, now watch this. We're going to identify what it was he gave them to possess, his possessions. The first Greek word we want to look at is the Greek word huparko, translated possessions. Now watch this. This is what this means. To begin, to make a beginning, to come forth, to be, to have. Huparko, possessions. So what Jesus is teaching his disciples is that his possessions were something that he already had, that he began, but that he possessed. Okay? What was he going to give his disciples on his departure, at his departure, that he had already begun, that was his possession? It was his kingdom. I believe it was his mission, the mission and the message of the kingdom of God. He began that message. It was his message. And upon his departure, he would entrust, he would deliver to his disciples the responsibility of that message and mandate. And at his returning, which we see later in the parable, he would demand of them an account of what they had done with that message and mandate, whether they were fruitful or whether they were slothful. And they would be judged upon that criteria. Are you with me? But watch this. Let's go on. The second word I want to look at is journey. This is the Greek word apodemeo. So this man, Jesus, who was about to go on an apodemeo, a journey, would deliver to his slaves the kingdom message and mandate. Now watch this. We can identify, based upon this word apodemeo, journey, when this parable was to be accomplished, when it would be fulfilled. In other words, when this journey would be accomplished. Go with me to Matthew chapter 21. And this Greek word apodemeo is only used 4 times outside of Matthew 25. It's used in Matthew 21, Mark 12, and Matthew 20. And in all of those texts, we find it in the parable of the vineyard. And it starts like this, Matthew 21, verse 33. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a wall around it, and dug a winepress in it, and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. Apodemeo. Okay? Now, here's what's interesting about this parable, the parable of the vineyard. We know that the apodemeo, the journey, culminated at the return of this landowner to judge those who had killed his slaves and his son. And Jesus interprets that as the destruction and the removal of the Old Covenant kingdom in AD 70, when the saints, the other nation, would receive that kingdom at the coming of the Lord. That took place in AD 70. The apodemeo, the journey, was culminated in apodemeo at the coming of the Lord. That's the same word as Matthew 25, verse 14. It's the same journey as well. It is the man going on the journey and bestowing upon his servants the responsibility and the mission and the mandate of his kingdom message. But that journey, according to Matthew 21, Mark 12 and Luke 20 was culminated in AD 70 at the judgment of the Old Covenant world. And at that time, the righteous would be judged too. They would be judged on their faithfulness to the kingdom message, on their faithfulness to what they had received as truth. That means that the parable of the talents and the judgments of the righteous, based upon their faithfulness and their stewardship and their increase of the kingdom, would take place at the coming of the Lord, at the return of the man from his journey, from his apodemeo in AD 70. And we have lots more to say on the parable of the talents next time on Answers in Eschatology. Bye for now.